Welcome to the Impacting in C Points lecture, or my alternate subtitle, How to Make People Care About What You're Actually Saying. First, a little bit introduction. My name is Zylstra. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, to be doing this camp. I just graduated from Eastview High School in Apple Valley, Minnesota. I'm going to be heading to the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the fall on Wisconsin. Fantastic school. Um, and probably the reason why I was invited to do this talk, I am the 2025 NCFL champion, which was great. And I did 2025 NSDA semifinals in US Extemp, which is also lovely, great experience. Put me in some company that I'm absolutely jealous of, and a lot of people who are far better at Extemp than I am. But the whole reason why I would say I'm doing this talk in the first place is because of the work of my coach, Todd Herring. For those of you who are really tuned into the world of extemporaneous speaking, you might know who this is. He's been the coach of my school, Eastview, for forever, since it opened in 1997, created or coached a lot of really good extempers, Wei Zhang, Ali Nathan, a lot of people from before we were born. But the reason why I'm talking about my coach in this lecture is because oftentimes people ask me, what's my best piece of extemp advice? Like, what's the best piece of advice I've received? What's my best advice for other people? And my advice really relies on Mr. Herring's philosophy, what he tells me to do before I'm nervous for every round, which is answer the, I'm going to bleep that out, question. At the end of the day, that's what Extemp is all about. And I think impacting, impacting your points, your C point, is the way to not only answer the bleeping question, but also tell a judge why your answer matters and why your answer is the right one overall. This is what's going to differentiate you from a 3 or a 4 to be getting that 1 or that 2 and really put you in those upper echelons of content relative to other extemp speakers. So that's the biggest reason why I think we should be delivering this today, why we should be talking about impacting. Todd Herring mentioned in the chat, love that. Yeah, that's the biggest reason why I think we should be talking about impacting today. And if you want to talk about like the psychological reason for why impacting is a thing, we can talk about the effect heuristic. I think I'm saying that right. I hope so. This is a psychology thing that I'm going to completely admit I did not know existed until like about a week ago, but I was doing research and was like, hey, what makes impacting matter? And this is the psychological explanation for that. So essentially the effect heuristic is the belief that when it comes down to it, your decision making is made by your heart and your gut rather than your brain thinking things out. And this is really where impacts come into play in extemporaneous speaking. Because if you say, oh, this source says that XYZ is going to happen, which is the answer to my question, a judge says, okay, great, cool, it says that it's going to happen. You answered the question. But why should I care? And this impact is the why should I care aspect. And this is why you're going to see a variety of impacts in the world of extemporaneous speaking. But no matter what, they're going to hit the judge in the heart or in the gut emotionally to overtake that logical processing of, oh, well, XYZ. Because at the end of the day, there's only so many things they can listen to. So if they are emotionally tied into your speech, that's what's going to get you those ones. So you're talking about emotional impacts. I mean, basically every international extemporaneous speaking on the planet uses some sort of emotional impact, talking about the amount of people dying in a conflict, talking about people starving, talking about violence in a country as a way to pull in that emotion. That's that emotional impact. But even in more US extemp speeches, and even talking about more abstract concepts, as we're kind of going to talk about later on in this lecture, you can get that effect heuristic. Because if I'm talking about the decline of democracy in the United States, which is, I know, really a great thing to talk about. that's something that, yes, you can think about it logically. You can think, well, X, Y, and Z according to this study and this X, Y, Z that. But at the end of the day, if you're impacting and you're going to say that this is going to lead to more democratic decline, more democratic backsliding in the United States, to a judge who is an emotionally, as an American citizen, likely tied to the future of democracy in the United States, that is going to get at that effect heuristic. But if that was way too much psychology talk for you, no need to worry. I also have a little pop culture explanation for why impacts matter. So I trust you all have seen the movie Avengers Infinity War. And the biggest moment in Avengers Infinity War is this snap. This Thanos literally snaps his fingers, and half of the life in the universe is evaporated at that point. Now, imagine you're watching Avengers Infinity War, and nobody actually explained to you what the snap did. Like, nobody said, oh, this is going to, like, wipe off half of the life of the universe of the planet. Imagine that never happened. Imagine you're just watching this guy get all of these stones, killing people. You're like, why is this guy killing people? And then he just snaps his fingers. You would just think that he's snapping his fingers. And that's the way that a lot of people do impacts and make them not complete. They say, oh, well, this thing is happening. Oh, yeah, he's just snapping his fingers. But the impact part is what the consequences of that snap is. The half of everyone gone, and you can even go further down the line of 500,000 gone. Well, that means life in the universe is irreparably changed. The Avengers are screwed. Um, I mean, Mr. Stark, I don't feel so good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is why impacts matter, because if impacts didn't exist, you'd be watching an entire movie just to build up to this big purple guy snap his fingers. And the reason we're kind of talking about um impacting in terms of C points, and the reason I think hopefully something that can illuminate things a little bit more as to why we're talking about that, why we're talking about impacts, is if we go into this overall structure of an extemp speech. So the reason why impacts are called C points is that oftentimes people divide them out into A, B, and C. And C is going to be impact because it comes last in your speech, or at least I hope it does. So you could say that your A point is your claim. So you're saying at the start of your point, your topic sentence, what am I going to talk about in this point? Your B point is, well, hey, why am I talking about this? What's the context for me talking about this? Why is it important to talk about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then your C is what the consequences are of the thing that you're talking about. Essentially, what proves your answer is the right one to choose. Because the thing about extemp speaking is that there's no direct, like, there's no obligation to talk about a thing. Like, there's no, like, you don't pick a question and you say, oh, well, you have to make these 3 points. Extemp speaking is a sandbox. Extemp speaking, you can talk about whatever you want in the world. So if I'm a judge, I'm not only listening for if you're answering the question, but I also want to know why these 3 points are the ones you picked out. Why these 3 points are the most impactful to this question, and why I should listen to you talk about these 3 points over any other thing in the universe that you basically could have talked about. So your impact in this case is telling the judge, through you telling about the consequences, through you talking about the effects, why your answer was the one that absolutely should be chosen. So let's do an example here. If you've been reading the news at all recently, even just looking at Twitter, you'll see that we're kind of in the midst of this like nationwide gerrymandering battle. So President Trump, for those more international in the room, or if you've just been going on a news break this summer, totally valid. So President Trump wants to gain as many seats in Congress as possible. So he's basically directed Republicans, particularly those in Texas, to do a mid-cycle gerrymander, essentially draw the maps in their favor. What this most recently caused is Texas Democrats to flee the state in order to stop this gerrymandering, and also Democrats in places like Illinois and California and Maryland and all these places to also reconsider whether they want to gerrymander to counter. So if you were to give a speech about that right now, I'm just going to check. Nothing's going on in the chat. Beautiful. If you were to give a speech about that right now, what would the consequences of the nationwide gerrymandering battle be? Here's one point that you could look at, and here's why hopefully you can see why an impact is so important in your point. So first of all, here's your A part, your claim. You would say, for example, excessive gerrymandering will make politicians less responsive to voters and therefore cultivate distrust in democratic government. Now, to your average parent judge, especially a parent judge, you're going to be like, whoa, 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 whoa. How will drawing lines on a map make a politician less responsive to the needs of their constituents and their voters? And how in the hell will that cultivate distrust in democratic government down the line? So then your B point is your warmth. B point is your why I'm talking about this, why this is the point that I've chosen. You're explaining. And found this is where a lot of your really heavy hitting sources are going to come in. So here's one, Kazuki Imai, I hope I pronounced that right, professor of government at Harvard, saying that elections are a way to hold politicians accountable for what their constituency wants. But if many lawmakers are in safe seats, guaranteed to win by a relatively comfortable margin, 12, 15, 20 points, there's less incentive to respond to what voters want. And this is where you're making a lot of this logical argument in Extemp speaking, right? You're tying the logic of saying, well, if we're drawing the maps to make safe seats for Democrats or for Republicans or no matter what, if we're drawing the map to make more and more of those safe seats, which is the purpose of gerrymandering, then politicians are less needy to the needs of their voters. Because if they're going to win by 15, 20 points, if they know they're going to lock up that win, what's really the point of responding to a constituent's needs about healthcare, about veteran services, or even what they want to do at a national level regarding healthcare, the war in Gaza, or et cetera? Because you already know that you're going to win this election by 15, 20 points. So that's the connection there. That's the B sub point. And that's why I see someone saying like, oh, is this all in one sub point? Yes. And a lot of the time the warrant is going to be your most complicated. And that's kind of why I think it's really valuable. A problem that I get sucked into a lot is providing a lot too much background in a point, which doesn't leave enough time for the impact, which is something we'll cover later. But this is where you need to make that connection from your claim to why you're talking about it for your judge. And this goes into overall discussions of substructure, but overall, what your warrant is doing is setting up your impact. So don't spend too much time on it because your impact is going to be the meat and potatoes of your point. But your warrant is your way to set up this impact and why it matters. And then here's your C. Here's your impact. So according to Professor Catherine Kramer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, go Badgers, anti-democratic populist movements emerge when voters feel government isn't listening to them. So there's your impact of that B. There's why, because you could very well stop at the B point, right? You could say, oh, well, voters are going to be less responsive. And that's what I see a lot of people do in extemporaneous speaking. They simply stop at the B point because they say, hey, I've answered the question. The consequence will be that politicians will be less responsive. But the problem is at that point, your judge is still left wondering, well, why should I care about this? What will be the impact? What will be the consequences of an America in which politicians are less responsive to the will of the voters? And C is the way to make that clear. Your impact is the way to not only answer that question for your judge, but tell them what the consequences of that will be and why your answer is the right one. So where you could stop at the B and you could say, well, one consequence will be that politicians will be less responsive to voters. You need to take that further. And by taking that further, you can say, well, a consequence of politicians being less responsive to voters, according to this source that I found, because you want to source your impacts, is that anti-democratic and populist movements emerge when voters feel government isn't listening to them, according to this source that I found, Professor Catherine Kramer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this is what is going to differentiate you from other Extemp speakers who are simply going to stop at that B point. There, oh, we have some. Yes, it's all in one point, evidence-backed statement inside the point. And oh, sorry about that. And actually, great transition. And just so you guys know, we will have time for a little bit of a Q&A at the end of the session. I've built in time for that. But that's what essentially the point of this is, that your impact needs to be complete, because stopping at that B point is where many extemporaneous speakers end their argument, saying, well, I answered the question, it's done. But the impact is what makes your argument complete. Your impact is saying, not only is this the thing that's answering the question, but here's what the consequences of that thing will be. And here is why judge, parent who's listening to extempore speaking at a classroom at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, here is why my point is the one that you should be listening to. And that's why having that complete impact is going to be absolutely vital for your speech. Let's see. And that's kind of related, tied into that. And we can talk about, so now that we've kind of talked about like what an impact is, why it's valuable for your speech, why you should have them, why you want to complete your argument following all the way through. Let's talk about what actually makes that good impact. Because like I said, once again, you have this entire sandbox of options for things that you could choose in the world of extemp speaking, for points that you could make. So here's what makes it clear that you've chosen the right ones. I hope you can still see it, but magnitude, timeliness, and human relevance. Those are probably the top 3 things for what makes a good impact. And now you can choose, like I said, you can choose a lot more things that can make an impact valuable. But overall, if you want to make that connection to your judge, if you want to convince a judge who probably doesn't know the topic that you're talking about, why this matters, here are 3 incredibly important things to have. Magnitude, essentially, what is the scale of this impact? How many people will it affect? How many countries will it affect? How big is it, essentially? I hope you all know what magnitude means. Timeliness, because if an impact is coming, I mean, if you were to tell me that a massive meteor would strike Earth and wipe out all human life, I'd be naturally pretty concerned. But if you were now to tell me that that meteor would strike in the year 3200, well, I don't really care anymore. I'm off this earth. My great, 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 great grandkids are off this earth, etc. So good impact is not only having that magnitude, how big of the consequences that will be, but also talking about how soon it will happen. Obviously, the sooner the better, because if a judge thinks that it's way down the line versus happening right now, they're more likely to care about the thing that's happening right now. And then good impacts also have human relevance. So it's a lot, while impacts in extemp speaking often operate on a very theory level, you're talking about, well, this means this and X, Y, and Z. People only care the most when they think that it's something that could affect them as humans, or it could impact a human somewhere else in the world. So this is making sure that you're not only saying, well, in relation to the war in Gaza, you're saying, oh, well, bombs are dropping in Gaza and all these structures are being destroyed. You're saying that not only are bombs dropping in Gaza right now and structures are being destroyed, but the structures are the homes of people. The structures are the houses of worship of people, their hospitals and their schools and all of these things. So not only making it, oh, well, things are being destroyed, but things that people care about, things that directly impact the lives of humans in this world. So here's a little example. Oh, did I do that right? Let's hope that hold on. Where you go? Oh, skipped over a slide. But here's a way that you can kind of see those 3 elements of the impact in action. So you're impacting to a point or a speech about tariffs. Now, you could very well stop and say, well, President Trump's tariffs are going into effect and will have a bad economic impact on American household growth, or just have a bad economic impact in the United States, reduce spending power in the United States. You could stop there. But an impact is going further. An impact is you saying this. President Trump's tariffs, likely to take full effect by the fall, will reduce the average American's household income by $1,400. For the average American family, this means one less vacation, fewer nights out, or missing out on the traveling soccer team. And here you can see where these three elements of making a good impact kind of fit in. So first, you're talking about magnitude. You're saying we'll reduce the average household income by $1,400. You're not only saying, oh, it's going to reduce the average American's household income, because if it's reducing the average American's household by $1, well, like, who cares? That doesn't really mean anything. But if you're saying $1,400, well, now that has some magnitude to it. That has some heft. $1,400 is a good amount of money. Now, you're timely, because if you're saying, well, they're going to take effect by 2028, well, yeah, that matters. But, I mean, it's 3 years down the line. Most of you will probably be in college, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So who even cares? But now, by saying that they're likely to take full effect by the fall, because of all these negotiations that we're having with Mexico and China, et cetera. But if you're saying that they're likely to take full effect by the fall, you're saying that these reductions in household income are coming soon. This is a time frame that we can think about. I mean, we have school events scheduled, we have weddings, we're going to go to college football games, etc. So you're saying, okay, well, this is a close amount of time. The judge is saying, well, this is soon for me. And that makes them care a little bit more. And then the clincher, and I think the thing that will most likely separate you from other extempers, is talking about that human relevance, right? Because you could very well stop right here. You could say President Trump's tariffs likely to take full effect by the fall will reduce the average American's household income by $1,400. Great, cool. That's an impact. Good job, you win a prize. But that's not as complete as you can make it. Because if you're the average judge, you're saying you're now leaving them to piece together the puzzles, right? You're leaving them to think about what $1,400 would mean for their family, or for the neighbors down the street, or for your family. You want to piece that together for the judge by tying in that human impact for them. And that also means that you now have some opportunities to make your speech emotionally mature, emotionally dynamic. You're not only giving this boring speech about economics, now you have an opportunity to tie in human impact stories, bring in real emotion, which also makes your speech more dynamic and more likely to get a 1 or a 2. So here's this clincher. For the average American family, this means one less vacation, fewer nights out, or missing out on the traveling soccer team. And I think the best example of why this is really salient and why this really matters is if you look at politicians, right? When politicians talk, they don't operate in numbers. They don't say, oh, well, this is going to impact American economic growth by 1.4%. They impact American economic growth by 2.4%. If politicians are giving a speech, if politicians are on a debate stage, they're not talking about that. They're talking about stories. They're saying, oh, well, this person I met, because of President Trump's cuts to Medicaid, is going to lose their health care, which could mean that they don't have access to cancer treatment, which means that they aren't able to visit the doctor for preventative care, which means that they're not able to afford contraception care. That's that impact part. And that's what makes your speech now salient for the judge, because now you're not only operating in numbers, you're not operating in an abstract concept. You're operating in things that could have real human connections, either to them or to their family or to their neighbors, etc. So it's also important that you actually are able to make the impact in your speech, because if we're talking all of these things about what makes a good impact, how to impact, what an impact is, etc., but if you don't have time for it, if you aren't able to actually weave it into your point, then it doesn't really matter. So if you want to weave in your impacts, as I said, you're going from claim to warrant to impact. Sometimes it's kind of hard to make that sentence jump. And I think a big part of it is I think a lot of times people overcomplicate it. They say, well, I have to have this really nuanced statement. I have to make this wordplay. I have to do this. You have to have a statement to tie your warrant to your impact, but this can literally be, and here's the impact of this. I've said that many times in my speeches, and I'm sure that the other kind of extempers, whoops, I'm sure that the other like many other extempers have done this too. You can literally say, and here's the impact of this to tie in that warrant to your impact there. And there are a variety of ways you can say, and this is real impacts. And this goes beyond the abstract. This goes into real world happenings. I think saying the word impact is a good way, in my opinion, to not only make that roadmap for your judge, but also make that roadmap for yourself. Saying, okay, and this is the impact of this. I think that is what I find the most effective way. It's hard to give this talk overall because it's a lot easier to just do extemp. Like I don't like think about extemp when I'm doing it. Um, and I think you got a lot of you guys will find that if you have your impact, well, naturally it's going to weave itself into its warrant. But if you're having a hard time tying that back, well, now here's your opportunity to say, and this is the impact of this. Because then your judge, who may or may not say on your critique sheet, oh, here, like, I wanted impacts on this point. Well, now you're literally handing it to him in a silver platter. You're saying, okay, I'm going to impact now because I'm a good extemper, and I'm going to say that by saying, okay, this is real impacts. And then also, the best impacts I would say are around 30 to 45 seconds. Obviously, you want your point to sit at the 130 to 145 range, not going over 2 minutes, not being excessively short, making sure you have that good time balance. And I think the best way to do that is having that impact be the 30 to 45 second range. So what's important in this aspect is that you can't waste too much time in that claim or in that warrant. And I think that's where a lot of people don't have the opportunity to make fully fleshed out impacts because they either have some complicated on top where they're talking about this personal story, which is effective, but then that personal story goes 30 seconds. You don't have time for it. Or they're spending way too much time in the background. Like my biggest problem and why I often didn't have enough time for impacts is I'm saying, well, hey, I have to explain all these caveats and these niches and all this part of why I'm choosing to talk about this. But at the end of the day, kind of as we've established, the impact is the thing that is going to be the most, pun unintended, impactful in your speech, right? The impact is going to be the meat and potatoes of your point. It's going to be what actually communicates this idea across to a judge and explains to them why it matters. So you need to make sure when you're fleshing out this speech that you have not only saved time for your impact on your flow, but you don't have like 2 or 3 bullet points in between the claim and the impact. You should really only have, I mean, 3 or 4. You should really only have 1, maybe 2, if you really want to. But that third point needs to be, you need to make sure that you have time for it. Because if you are giving this point, if it's your first point, for example, and you're about to start your impact, all of a sudden you get the 4. This means that you're having those time management problems. And this means that you can't fully flesh out your impacts, meaning that you won't get their full usage. Let's see. So here's kind of the TLDR. Too long to read. Impacts are, in my opinion, the most important part of your speech. You're not only answering the question, but you're also telling the judge why they should be listening, why the answer that you chose is the one that they should be listening to. Why the answer that you chose is the most important, why the answer that you chose is the most consequential and will not only impact some family it will impact some family across the world, will impact the state of democracy in the United States, or most meaningfully will impact them and their family. And why this is a speech that they should not only give time and attention to, 7 minutes out of their Saturday morning, but also why their speech is the most important. Your speech is the most important one to listen to. Why they should give you the one or the two because they go home and think, wow, that was a really important point to make. The impact is the thing that bridges that, not only from answering your question, but also to making that jump, explaining to the judge why your point is the most valuable. So, I am comfortable into getting into the Q&A portion now. That's all I have for you guys regarding impacts. All right, so Elisa, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, says, would you need to add in a source for numerical impacts? Yes, the answer is yes. And I think that's something I probably should have covered more, but impacts are most often sourced. I would say 95% of the time. There's a 5% chance that you can get away with not sourcing an impact because it's just something that kind of explains itself away. But impacts 95% of the time need to be sourced because that gives the credibility to your argument, right? That means that not only is this something that you care about, but it's obviously something that people are writing about. People say this is a real thing that is going to happen. And especially for numerical ones, I mean, you can't just be like making up numbers. I think that numerical, that quantitative impact, which Elisa, I'm glad you highlighted because quantitative is a really great way to have that magnitude part of your impact. That is a part where you unequivocally, yes, you need a source there. All right, Ahan, what is the timing strategy you use? Um, to be honest, one of my like weakest points as an Extemp speaker has probably been my time management, to be completely honest. Um, I mean, I was even struggling with this at 2025 nationals, NSTAs. I think overall, I just kind of have a few reminders in my head. My reminders are I can't have my intro go over 130. I need to get out of my first point. I need to be getting out of my first point by the time I see that four. And I need to be getting out of my second point by the time I see that two. And I need to be getting out of the three by the time I see it at 30. At absolute minimum. Those are kind of I've joked with my teammates and with my coaches that those are kind of my GTFO signals. Um, you can piece together what that means. But I think if you're more asking about like, oh, what it means in terms of a sub point, in terms of like having that time for your impact, I think just reminding yourself, I think kind of the best way to go about it is kind of what I talked about, um, which is just not filling up your flow too much. That's the thing that my coaches reminded me a lot of, is that if you have a crowded flow, like if you're writing a lot of things on your notepad, um, that means that you're inherently going to have something more to talk about, right? That you're going to have more things that you feel like you have to talk about. So I think just making sure that your flow isn't as crowded and making sure that you physically see that you have space, that you have time to make that impact C sub point is probably the most valuable. And also making sure that like when you're giving those on tops, that they're not these long drawn out stories, long drawn out jokes, but also making sure that they're just quick get in, get out, 50-second maximum type things. Let's see. Do you always source impacts or the 8 point since I do 2 sources per MP and I always source my B? I think the most valuable because I will normally do at least 2 sources per point. And obviously like if you're beginning an extemp, it's something that you kind of have to work up to. Um, but I think if you're having at least two sources in your point, a lot of the times where that naturally flows in is at the top and at the bottom of your points. Like if you're watching a lot of these next circuit speeches, you'll see an extemper give their topic sentence. And then immediately after giving their topic sentence, you're saying, according to the Washington Post, an article published yesterday. And then they give their background, which essentially comes out to be their warrant. So how you'll normally operate is having a point for your warrant and having a point for your impact. I've gone sometimes having 2 points in my warrants and 2 points in my warrants and 1 point in my impacts. You can also do 1 point in your warrant, 2 points in your impacts. But I think unequivocally, yes, you have to make sure that you're sourcing your impact and your C point, because then not only is the judge saying, oh, well, this is impactful, this is a real thing, but also this is a real thing that is happening. Because if you're saying, oh, well, this is going to be the consequences of this thing, but you don't source that, then it's not a real consequence because the judge has no reason to believe you. So is the claim warrant impact all for one main point or one sub point? I'm sorry. So that's for one main point. So that's like for your first point in your speech. That claim warrant impact structure, that's your substructure. That's your structure to a point in your speech, not necessarily a sub point. All right, Elevensky, how do you find the right balance of background info, actual warrants, especially with at local tournaments with parent judges? That's another thing that I think is a really hard thing to kind of find that balance of in Extemp. And it's something that I've kind of struggled with for a while. I think the best part of weighing to like filter yourself when it comes to like background info and actual warrants is ask, is this responsive to the question? Like, is this in line of responding to the question? That's what like the herrings would kind of always get on me about. Well, you're giving me this info, great, good to know. But if it's not actually responsive to the question, if it just feels like an add-on, then why is it in the speech, right? I think a good exercise to respond to that is to like give a point, for example, and then just literally just go line by line, sentence by sentence, and say, is this responsive? Does this matter to me answering the question? And if it doesn't, then that's where you found your excessive warranting. That's where you found your excessive background. And that's where you can find the stuff that you have to chop. Let's see. Does someone write down when the time signals? Yes. Catherine, you have that right. So the the 5 fingers at 2 minutes, you should probably be well into your first point by then. And then my GTFO signals, as I was kind of talking about, is when you get that 4, that is kind of at least my signal to say, hey, start wrapping your first point up. Your 2 is you're going to be, hey, I have to absolutely start wrapping. Ideally, you would be beyond that at this point. But your 2 is, okay, I absolutely need to get out of my second point. And then your C is, okay, I absolutely need to get out of my third point. And that C is coming at 6:30, that 2 is coming at 5, and that 4 is coming at 4 minutes. All right. Lisa, again, for past, present, future, or problem cause solution substructure, what's the best way to discuss both the impact and the future implications or solution? Do you just do it all at once? I think like, yeah, I think Ahan's answer was pretty good. Talking about it's kind of an older form of substructure. I think you can talk about the future. I think future implications, obviously, when you're talking about impacting, well, anything is really going to be a consequence. Anything is obviously going to be a future implication in that way. Um, I think to almost answer your question, I think the impact and the future implications are almost the same thing. Like if something is happening, well, that is the implication of that, right? And I think a thing that is hard, and I think a thing that's it's really easy to get tied into is wanting to do like second or third level impacts, which is saying, oh, well, this is the impact of my point, and this is the impact of that, and there's the impact of that. Because that happens all the time in global politics and geopolitics and economics and that stuff. There's obviously going to be a ripple effect. But I think kind of being able to limit yourself and saying, okay, I'm gonna stop at this um impact. I'm just going to stop at this first or second level impact is the probably best way to go about it. And then regarding problem cause solution substructure, I think that's another thing that I probably should have addressed more low key. But yes, when you're talking about like a solution speech, a solution based one about how to solve this problem, the impact is going to be the impacts of your solution. And honestly, the best way that I substructure those speeches is okay, here's the problem, here's the cause, and then wanting to make sure that you have the solution, and the impact is the fact that your solution is the one that works, right? Because if you just stop at the solution and you're saying, okay, well, here's the problem, here's the cause, here's what we should do to fix it, and you don't actually provide statistics to as that why that solution was work, then that's kind of what I was referring to is stopping at your B point, right? But the impacts in that sense is talking about, okay, here is what would happen if my solution was implemented. And I think that's like the best, and I think those speeches are the ones where you can have kind of the best impacts and where it's a lot easier to find them because there's a lot of research and there's a lot of like studies and et cetera that show, okay, if we did this thing, what would the impact of that be? And I think in that case, if you're doing a how should we solve this, your impact is what are the impacts of your solution? This doesn't really have anything to do with lecture. What are your thoughts on singing for your AGD? Um, I tried that. I will say I'm right there with you. I'm a choir kid. Um, I tried it we had this like intro competition at one of my first practices, and it was like 15 kids, and I sang in it. And my coach was like, "That was really funny. Never do that again." And like, I'm not hating on it, honestly. Like, I don't think if that's something that really speaks to you, sure. I think if you get to a higher level of extemp, I think it'll be seen as a little bit gimmicky or a little bit unprofessional. And if you get kind of can sacrifice your credibility a little bit. I think if you want to include song lyrics, that's a great way to have your HDD. Like that's a great form of a pop culture tie and a little bit of a lighter moment. I think just actually singing in it is something that judges might look down on at a point, which I kind of resent, but it's just kind of how it is. David, yep. Uh, five fingers wrapping well first point, or start wrapping up first. Yes, that's absolutely right. Let's see. So yesterday we went over substructure with A, B, and C, but C in this lecture was thus this means this. But here C is the impact. Yeah, no, I completely get that you're piecing everything together. Yes, the impact is the C. So yes, so the C is thus like your explanation is actually fantastic. The thus this means this. This means is another way to make an impact statement. This means that this will happen is okay, here's the impact of this thing happening. And I think that's a good way to tie it. I get it. And honestly, like I think substructure especially can get really confusing. And this is why I kind of like what I talked about earlier is that it's a lot harder to talk about extemp. It's a lot easier to actually just do it. Um, I think this is a thing, and especially substructure is something that sounds really confusing in hindsight, and then when you actually put it into practice, it becomes a lot more simple. So I think the biggest like takeaway from that and what you're talking about with substructure is yes, that C, this impact point is what are the consequences? And in every point, you want to make sure that not only is your answer responsive, but you're having that impact of what this means. And then I think I missed one about kind of like, yes, Anthony Babu power lines. Um, I think what you're kind of referring to is kind of like that sentence at the end of your point. And I think that is in it is an overall tie into your impact, right? Because if I'm talking about Gaza, for example, and I'm talking about the effect of Israel cutting off aid to Gaza, then I think your impact in this sense is saying Israel is cutting off aid to Gaza, which, according to this source, means that 20,000 Gazans will lose their lives to starvation, and 15,000 more will and 50,000 more will lose family members. And then your power, so that's your impact there. Your claim is okay, Gazans are going to be harmed by this cutoff of aid. Your impact is okay, X amount of people are losing their lives to starvation because that's a real human impact. And I think where that Anthony line, that power line would come in is essentially saying this kind of wrap up to your point, wrap up to your impact, saying through this decision, Israel is not only making an abstract strategy call in a war, but killing Gazans and irreparably harming the fabric of Gazan society. Like that would be your power line, for example. So I think you can't just say, okay, Israel is cutting off aid to Gaza. Through this decision, Israel is irreparably harming Gazan society and get that power line in. Because then your judge is like, whoa, 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 why are they doing that? How are they doing that? Etc. And I think that's where your impact comes in. So that power line that you're talking about, really good way. And just I think making sure you have that at the end of your actual impact is probably the best way to go.